Hey guys, this is Lucid, and we are going to be doing a national overview for Xibalba. I expect this will actually be a two-part overview, and the second part will be testing out different kinds of expansion. And the reason is because expansion with middle-aged Xibalba is not terribly easy. This is an interesting nation. It is a nation, I would say, with a pretty high skill cap, but also a pretty high skill threshold. Meaning, if you are not very good or kind of new or anything like that, this is probably not the nation for you. They don't have extremely obvious strengths. In a lot of ways, it feels like you have to kind of MacGyver stuff together, using whatever you're held hostage with, some twine and some duct tape and your pocket knife, and you have to fashion that into some sort of lethal weapon. Now, they do have things they can do, but they're just not overwhelming and obvious like a lot of other nations have. And a lot of times, that's something you'll see very good players do, is actually pick nations that have really, really strong attributes and say, this is your problem now, you have to figure out how to deal with it. Xibalba doesn't really have those. That being said, it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because you can play them in a lot of different ways. So, taking a step back, Xibalba in the Middle Age is a nation with toads. And in the early age, it's a nation with basically bats and scorpions. The scorpions are completely gone from the roster. And instead, they have the muke, the toads. Now, Mictlan and Xibalba, switching from early age to middle age, lose most of their blood hunting. Or they lose their kind of titles as like blood powerhouses. Middle age is kind of an age of low blood magic, whereas early and late have a good bit. And what that ends up meaning is that the nations that do have it, it's a bit more special. And for Mictlan in the Middle Age, they lose all blood hunting on all of their mages, and but they keep their blood summons, so they can still get Oslotls, the murder kitties. Xibalba, on the other hand, they keep access to a fair number of their blood mages. However, they lose all their blood summons. And your access to blood is reduced from early age Xibalba. Early age Xibalba can get them in all their forts. For you, you can only get them, we'll cover some of these in a lot more detail, but you can get the Camazots, but you can only get them, I believe, in caves and maybe in the capital. Caves in the capital. The ways, you can get them in forests, and they're blood ones. So you have fine blood access, but it's not like amazing blood access like you had before, and you don't have the cheap blood one site searchers like early age Xibalba had. Once you have accumulated a bunch of blood slaves, you have to decide how to spend them. And invariably, you will want to spend them on generic blood magic and blood items. So this is especially if you're playing single player and you want to give yourself a way to kind of explore the game, this is a very good way, to explore generic blood magic, because it's a nation that gets pretty good access to blood, but doesn't have a lot of the summons and the, anything national to really spend the blood slaves on. In exchange for that, they gave up all the blood magic. What they get is they get amphibious troops, because these toadies can jump in the water. They're amphibians. They fight without stat penalties. And this is also very significant, because in the Middle Age is the age. In addition to being a low blood magic age, it is the age with the best water nations. So if you're fighting in Middle Age, how to deal with underwater is very important. And this is one of the land nations. There's a lot of amphibious stuff in the Middle Age. Like a lot of the underwater nations like Relay and Atlantis, they're all very amphibious. On the other hand, there's a fair number of land nations which are pretty amphibious. Like Airmore can go underwater, Scalaria can go underwater, You have Agartha, which can go underwater. Xibalba can go underwater. I think there's some more too. We could go and look at them all, but that is an important part of this nation. Is you certainly can go underwater. You have decent water mages who can cast. You know, this guy can do summon water power, and he can make. If you put 4 water gems on him, he can make a big water elemental. So, and you have, you know, your super big water mages too. So you have stuff you can do underwater, which is really important. If it basically means that if you get really big and strong, like maybe twice the size of a water nation, you could choose to eat them potentially. It also means that a lot of land nations, water nations, feel like they can just mess with, you know, like they're just going to poke them. But that's not the case with Xibalba. With Xibalba, if a water nation is going to poke you, they had better kill you, because you can turn around and fight right back at them. So, that I think is the super high level overview. I would say there are some challenges with this nation, and one of the biggest challenges is doing expansion. And there's obvious ways... Excuse me. There's obvious ways to deal with expansion, like just get an expansion pretender, and that's certainly something you can do. I don't think anybody would laugh at you. So that's one of the problems. How do you deal with expansion? You can do scales expansion. That's one of the things we're going to do in the following episode on this. But you may choose to have an expander. The other question is, how are you going to win your first war? And the reason that that's a kind of open question is because your national troops lack a certain amount of overwhelming power. Like, there's not, like, look at these guys, okay? We're not going to go through each of them, but these are basically indie level stats, okay? They have a bit more HP than humans, they have a bit more strength, but otherwise it's like indie stats, okay? They're not horrible, and you know, this guy doesn't have a hat. I can't remember, it doesn't look like any of your frogs have hats, which is a problem in an era where there's plenty of archers, and we're starting to get some crossbows too. So, anyway, yeah, how are you going to win your first war with your troops? Because in the first war, troops matter a lot, in my opinion. I think in everybody's opinion. That's why bless rushes. Oh my god, I can't talk. Bless rushes are a thing, is because you're more reliant in the first war on your troops than you are on your mages. That being said, you know, being a blood nation, if you're really getting rushed and you've been recruiting blood mages, you can do a bunch of imp summoning in a really important decisive combat and potentially turn it. But still, that's not something you're going to want to be doing on the offensive. So, we'll get into it. And here's the thing too, as a disclaimer, until you play a nation in multiplayer, basically, your opinions are just opinions, and that's my situation right now. I haven't played them in a multiplayer game. I have lost the game to middle-aged Xibalba, so, and I fought against them, so I have a decent idea about how they work, but it's a lot different when you actually play them. So, let's talk about the unit roster. We'll talk a little bit about potential directions you can go for your build, and then we'll close out this episode with some tips and tricks where we talk about some little dirty, nasty things you can do with this nation to make them pretty okay. Okay, so are we going to talk about all of the toads? No, we're not. The militia, these guys are very cheap. They actually hit sort of hard. They have kind of shit morale, though, and shit attack and defense. These attack and defense are so bad, especially when combined with the morale. I don't think I would ever get them. Yeah, I think they just run too much is the problem. It's kind of the thing, like, the combination, like, bad morale in and of itself is a problem, but when you combine that with low protection, low defense, and low attack, it means, like, the faster they get killed, the more likely they are to run as well. So it's like, there's an anti-synergy here, or a negative synergy. Next up, we have the Muke Dart Throwers. They're kind of interesting. They get these obsidian darts, which I believe, and we can test it, I believe the damage scales with strength linearly. Yeah, because it's 0 damage, and this is going to be 12 damage equals 12 strength. So potentially, if you get Strength of Giants on these guys, this could potentially be a 16 damage arrow, which is going to be fired at close range and probably reasonably effective. And you do have Earth access on this nation, so this is something you could potentially look to do. Only 4 ammo, though, and then they're going to run into combat with the Stone Dagger, and Stone Daggers kind of suck. But, yeah, you could probably dream up a use for those. I think the problem is if you're going to spend the time buffing them, you probably want more than 4 ammo. Okay, and then for the Warriors, I guess we are going to go through most of them. This guy, I think, is a much... So he's more expensive than the Militia, but he's now got okay morale. He's actually got pretty good defense. The Militia has 8 defense, and this guy, because of his hide shield, is going to have 12 and 10 attack, so he can actually hit things. This guy, I think this is definitely one of the things we're going to test out as we do Scales expansion, and just have a huge amount of these dudes. The Mook Warrior, they get an Obsidian Club. I'm not sure which one would be better. Let's take a look at the costs here. This one's 3 resources for the Spear with 14 damage, and this one's... I think this depends what you're fighting against. If you're fighting against high armor stuff, the Spear's better. If you're fighting against really low armor stuff, this might be better. But the Spear's also going to get the very low chance of having a repel. I think the Spear's probably the better one here. These guys have better armor. If we look at the protection on these dudes, it's only 8. But on these guys, they've got bronze scale halberds. And so the protection on these guys is 11. And I believe it's 1 more damage also on... because it's a bronze spear rather than a stone spear. So they get a bonus 1 damage. Definitely worth it if you have the resources to make them. A very nice upgrade on these previous dudes. And then these guys basically, they don't actually get a weapon upgrade. It's the same Obsidian Sword Club, but they have better armor. So I don't know. I think these guys are probably the guys I would roll with. Yeah. And then we have the Sacreds. So... these special colored, we have 3 varieties of Sacreds, and they're kind of cool. And they have some really weird traits about them. This poisonous skin, which we'll talk about it. It's a really, really weird thing. And it's not very clearly explained in the game, but I will share with you what was shared with me about how it actually works. So, the Chakmuk Dark Thrower, Sacred, right? Amphibious Swamp Survival, Dark Vision 50. He's got a poisoned bronze spear with a strong poison on it. This is a pretty scary poison. And this will apply on damage. And with 15 piercing damage, it's going to be pretty likely to hit. And then he has a poison dart, which also has 4 ammunition and does paralyzing poison. And also, this will scale with strength. So if you take a strength buff, these actually could be pretty potent poison darts. We might try this out. I think definitely something to consider for this nation is taking a bit of a strength bless. Because when we look at like the holes that this nation has, it like has a lot of different flavors of chaff. Like even the Sacred is like very chaffy. We have other Sacreds which are less so, but what we need is a way to kill some elite targets, right? Which the troops are not very good at. And if you've been watching the tournament game, you'll notice the Xibalba player has been using very mage-heavy lineups. And that's because the troops are kind of more like supports. Or that's kind of how he's been using them. So, and I totally understand that. Okay, next up we have the Chakmuk Obsidian Warrior. And this guy has a poisoned obsidian blade. Magic weapon with paralyzing poison. That is pretty good. This is a pretty darn powerful weapon. And with size 2, this is now like an elite killer. If you compare the weapon stats, this is only 15 and it's non-magical. And you compare it to this, which is 19 magical and with the paralyzing poison attack, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Now, if they have a lot of poison resistance, it can negate, and also if they're really big, it can negate. And I believe because this is fatigue damage, their poison resistance will count double towards negating the poison, though I'm not totally sure. But that being said, this is very similar to the barb attack on like devils, and devils will mess up thugs. Like they'll turn 1, jump on thugs in the back, and that paralyzing poison will knock them out in like 1 turn. So I expect in the right circumstances, this can be very powerful. And okay, it's time we talk about poisonous skin. So poisonous skin, the tooltip reads, the skin of this unit is poisonous, and anyone coming in contact with it will be affected by the poison. The poison causes the victims to stiffen and eventually become immobile. Large beings are less affected by this. This doesn't tell you what it does. Okay, I'm going to tell you what it does. If you have a linked to 0 weapon, you will take fatigue damage. And I believe it's poison typed, though I'm not 100% sure. I'm pretty sure. And it will be negated somewhat if you're large. Let me see if I can dig it up, actually. Okay, so I went and looked it up, and it's basically what I said. It's fatigue damage, poison fatigue damage. So if you have poison resistance, or you have weapons that are longer than 0, it's not going to do anything. You may say, okay, well, what is it good for? And the answer is probably not much. The only thing it's kind of good for is maybe stuff without poison resistance with link 0 weapons, like heavy cav. But even then, like, do you really want these guys eating a lance charge? And will this knock them out before the heavy cav kill them? And these are all important questions that I don't have the answer to. I think it's probably best to say it's probably not going to be useful. There's maybe some scenarios where it could kill like an elf thug or something, but I don't know. Pretty situational, I think. But that is the Meek Warrior. And if we look at their stats, 15 HP, 13 protection. They have 2 base, which are a little more than humans, given that they're toads. 11 MR, 12 strength, 11 attack, 12 defense. We'll compare that to their big brothers, which are the Womuk. And these guys have way more HP at 26. Their protection, their natural protection is all the way up at 6. And so that's going to actually give them a pretty good armor value, especially when combined with their Obsidian Curious, which is pretty good. Strength a bit higher, and they still have a magic weapon. This one doesn't have the poison fatigue attack, but that's probably fine. I believe their MR is actually a bit lower. Yeah, these guys have 1 more MR. And importantly, these guys are size 3, so they don't pack nearly as well if you're trying to buff them or get them, their attack density up, but that can also be fine. I think, like, attack density on cap-only Sacreds, not really that big of a deal. You're usually not going to have enough of them where you're going to form, like, more than 1 line in a big combat. And then it's like, do you really need more? These are all questions. Okay, so that's the Womuk. You do get access to some Zots, and the Zots you can get in forests and in caves. The problem with Zots in the Middle Age is the Indies are a bit harder than in the Early Age, and Zots already got nerfed very, very hard coming from Dominions 4 to 5, where when we switch to real-time combat, flyers don't get first strike anymore. And you combine that with these guys having like horrible morale and basically no armor at all, and this like 9 damage is like worse than Hoberg level damage. Stone Lance. These guys are very, very, very bad. Like, if there's like, they might not be able to even kill 1 elf PD because they wouldn't be able to kill the elf commander. I mean, they are really, really, really bad. That being said, they're stealthy. These guys hit a good bit harder. I think probably in no circumstance would you want a 9 damage piercing versus a 15 damage slashing and blunt. I think this is just so much more damage. But, I mean, they do get a charge bonus, but I don't think that's going to make up for it. 10 attack, what is this? 10 attack, yeah. Anyway, they're all bad stats, but the important thing about them is they're flying and they're stealthy. They can help you pop forts quickly. They can jump in the back line and maybe distract. Once you get buffs on them, they can at least survive for a little bit. So maybe you get wooden warriors, you put it on them. They attack rear. They can be a distraction in the back for a while. Sorry, I have the hiccups. But that's these guys. One thing that is very important to mention is this guy, the Jungle Warrior. And this is one of the reasons why your forests are super important. We already mentioned you can get the Way, which is one of their blood nature mages in forests. But what is also very important is you can get the Muke Warrior. And basically, it's about the same stats as the other Muke Warriors. He's 10 gold, 5 resources, 9 recruitment points, and you've got 14 hit points, 8 protection, and then 10 attack and 12 defense. And if we compare that to, like, what kind of weapon does he have? He has a club. If we compare that to one of our other club-wielding dudes like this, it's basically the same. All these stats look the same. Now, compared to the guys with bronze scale hauberks, you know, these guys have a bit more protection. Anyway, they, you know, there's something to say about these for being superior to the jungle warrior. But what is different about the jungle warrior and what makes him good and special in forests is he's stealthy. So that's pretty important. Having a stealthy force, very, very nice, especially if you're being led by bat mages. These guys can be, these are kind of like your toad elves, if you will. So I think less so for expansion. Expansion, you don't care about stealth. But for your first wars, your second wars, having a big stack of stealthy dudes is pretty good. And one thing we should also mention about toads is they do siege pretty well. Because they have a bit more strength than humans, but they have the cost of humans. You're going to get, you know, a pretty good bang for your buck in terms of siege power. I forget how much bats siege for. Yeah, actually not much better than humans. So, yeah, we also have a couple more varieties. You can get toads underwater. I don't think there's anything too special about them, except, yeah, I don't think so. I mean, they're basically just like your other toads. This one has a net, which can be good against, like, cavalry and stuff. It stops working against, like, size 4 things, but I think they'll toss a net on if they can hit. They still have to hit for the net to work. So there's a pretty good chance they miss, but anyway, there's a chance they hit. And if the net hits, whoever they get it on is pretty much dead. So anyway, these are options. We've been through the units now. What is the summary? You basically have a bunch of different flavors of chaff. The notable ones here are the Muke Warrior with the bronze spear. He's pretty good. The cheaper Muke Warrior in terms of resources has the stone spear, also pretty good. The Muke Jungle Warrior for being stealthy. And then these guys, potentially you could do a hilarious Strength Bless on them. Actually, all the Sacreds will enjoy a Strength Bless. But these guys are also your big hard-hitting dudes, which are going to be kind of your best anti-elite. And I think that is their job, in my opinion, is that is a hole you have in your lineup. How are you going to deal with, like, hard-to-kill stuff? And I think the Womuke do a pretty good job at that. But there's also something worth mentioning about them. Because their base natural protection is pretty high, you could potentially consider taking like a hard skin bless on them, which would get their base natural protection up, I believe, to 11, which will give them a pretty healthy, like probably close to 20 protection. So that's probably not a horrible option either. Okay, and on to the mages. So we have these guys, the Muka Jaws, and they are pretty okay. They have a priest level, and they're basically, I mean, they're basically going to bless themselves. You can, especially if you have a decent bless with them, you can potentially thug. Now, they're not going to be able to buff themselves, but if you have people to fluff them, do keep these guys in mind as potential thugs. They even come with a decent magic weapon, so potentially, you know, I mean, honestly, you don't even need that much. Maybe you put a hat on them, or maybe you don't even do that. Maybe you just use these guys naked. Maybe you put a miscellaneous item on them or give them a shield. But they don't need much. They're not going to be like horrifying, scary thugs, but they potentially can do their job. Next up, we have the Audits. These are very cheap. 65 gold for 9 research. If you have magic scales, they're going to research mighty quickly. They're not very useful. These are some of the not great level 1 paths. Underwater, these guys can do summon water power and become water 2, which is nice. On land, they're going to be stuck at Water 1, Death 1. And basically, they can do Frozen Heart or Animate Skeletons, which is pretty freaking bad. Then we have the Aha, and these guys are interesting because they're sacred. They don't have great stats, but these are pretty good paths for thugging. Water and Earth, you can do Iron Skin, Quickness, Temper Flesh, Breath of Winter. There's just a bunch of little things you can do with these. Underwater, you get more things you can do for thugging with them. And they're true amphibians, so these guys potentially can thug underwater and thug on land, though they're going to need a fair amount of gear. They come with no armor, they don't have great stats, but these paths do kind of scream out, hey, we're thugging paths, and potentially you can combine them with like one of these guys or a couple of these guys, and they can buff them or something like that. In terms of research, they're a good bit slower. Like, these guys are almost half the price, so they're going to have almost the same upkeep. The upkeep's 52 a year for one of these, compared to the Sacreds, which has an upkeep of 40 a year. So the upkeep's a little bit less on these, because they're sacred, but they're so much more expensive, I don't think it would take a really long time for it to pay off if you're just using these as lab monkeys. Anyway, the one thing I'll say, though, is in a pinch, especially if you have a good Earth income, these guys you can put an Earth gem on them and get them up to Earth 2. And from there, they can do a lot more useful things defending than a Water 1, Death 1 can. So, they can summon bigger Earth Elementals, they can do Strength of Giants, Legions of Steel. There's a bunch of things you can do with these guys if you're desperate. So, I would say taking these guys, I don't want to say it's different if you take these guys as your core researchers. You'll be better able to defend yourself, but you'll have probably less research or less units because they're more expensive. So I'm not sure which one's better. You'll have to decide on that. And then we get the first of our big toad mages, and these guys are pretty cool. So size 3, pretty good stats for strength and hit points and magic resistance. Not great morale, defense, or attack. Water 2, Earth 1, Death 1, and they get a Water random, an Earth random, a Death random, and a Nature random. So, well, let's talk about them. The Water random's kind of nice. So, first of all, I'm pretty sure you can get these guys in every fort. They're expensive. 300 gold is very pricey. And if you look at other things that are 300 gold, I don't know if these guys hold up that well. Water 3 is nice. Underwater, you can do summon water power and then do liquefy as a late mid-game sort of thing. The Earth randoms are very nice, though. Getting reliable access to Earth 2s is really good for buffing armies. It also means if you put Earth Boots on an Earth 2, they can do Army of Gold and stuff later in the game. Having access to Earth 2s is good. And the Death randoms are pretty nice. Because they can do Skelly Spam, but it's like a ton of money for a Death 2. And the Water 3s, I'm trying to think what you would do on land with Water 3s. They can do Falling Frost and things like that, but I think the best use on land would probably be put a Water Bracelet on them and let them do Liquefy, which is pretty okay. They can also, later in the game buff with Quickening, and they can also do buffs with Wave Warriors and things like that. So those are important things that all these guys can do with just Water 2 paths. And then the Nature random, you get access to Lion Pelts, which is pretty good with the Nature random, and you should have a fair number of Nature randoms. So you'll have reliable Earth Nature access. And then you can also do Foul Vapors with the Water Nature. So that's a pretty important cross path. And that makes these guys pretty important to the lineup. Okay, what else? We have assassins we can get out of our capital. And these are interesting because they're sacred. They have a big, scary poison blade. They're not priests, so they can't bless themselves. And I don't know. They're kind of expensive. And they're probably not going to be terribly successful. But I have used, because I've play tested these guys a few times, And you can do assassin expansion with them, but they don't do it great exactly. One thing that's kind of interesting you can do is you can take a larger on them, and that actually kind of works okay for assassins that are not able to bless themselves. Hilariously, I think you can also take Berserker. We're getting into like the expensive thing too, and like larger Berserker. These guys are actually pretty okay assassins in melee, but still not great. Anyway, you have assassins. Next up, but we'll talk about the middle-age Xibalba has pretty good assassin game, and it's not honestly because of these guys. It's because of your ways and your Camazots, which brings us to the Camazot. Now, these guys are Death 2, Blood 1, and then they have a random for Air, Earth, or Blood. So some of these are going to be Blood 2, some of these will be Death Air, and then some of these will be, have the Earth random. Now, this is important because you can Sabbath up, and you can have arbitrarily high levels of any of these paths. It means you can do Fog Warriors. It means you can do Army of Gold. It means you can do anything that you can do with any of these paths, including Death. So that is pretty good. That is pretty darn tootin' good. Yeah. Camazot, the other thing important about them is they're cold-blooded, like all your bats are. Your toads are not cold-blooded, which is a nice and welcome change from early age to middle age. But you can also twice-born them, and they're effectively going to be size 1 for twice-borning. So they're very cheap to twice-born. And next up, we have the Bacab, and the Bacab is Water 3, Earth 2, and has a chance to actually become Earth 3. So you actually get reasonably high Earth access with this nation, all the way up to Earth 3. And you potentially can get Death 2, which is not really great because we already have other deaths. Water 4, that's now very high. It means with the 2 kind of easy to make water boosters, you can be all the way up to Water 6, which is pretty darn tootin' high. And what was the other path? Nature? Yeah, not too much to say about nature. Same thing as the other ones. I think the most interesting ones of these for sure are the earth ones, and probably followed by the water ones, because having a really high-powered water caster can also be pretty nice in combat. Honestly, as a liquefy mage, I think is the best use for them. For those who don't know, liquefy is like an area of effect soul slay, so it's pretty good. But everybody says water magic sucks. Guess they haven't been liquefied enough. And then, yeah, okay, we get a Scout, we get a Bacab, you can get these in the forests, a Muke Bacab you can get in the forest, and the Way. The Way is the other really important one. These guys can shape change into a Jaguar. And we'll have to look at it. I can't remember. I don't think you'll want to Thug. It's, I think, more like an escape vehicle. We'll look at all the ways you might want to use the second form. Importantly, well, we'll have to look at it. I can't remember. But, okay, let's talk about the Way, because this is an extremely important unit for the faction. Because otherwise, it's kind of like a different but worse Xibalba, like compared to early age. Except you're losing cold-blooded, which is pretty nice on a lot of things. But the Way are very... okay, before I talk about this, there's one thing I have to get off my chest. These bats, by the way, for those of you who don't know, bats are mammals, and mammals are warm-blooded, and frogs are amphibians, and frogs are cold-blooded. But yet, the bats have cold-blooded, and the frogs don't. So somebody go figure me that, okay? It makes sense for citizen stuff to be cold-blooded because they're reptiles. Reptiles and amphibians are cold-blooded. They can't regulate body temperature very well. Bats are warm-blooded. Don't understand. Anyway, the Way. These guys are very special. For those of you who've seen my national overview on Miklin, they get the Nahuli, who can turn into a turkey and fly around. And I love having flying Nature 2s. Nature 2 is just a great path. It is great for buffing, for fluffing. It is great for battlefield-wide buffs. You can do Mass Protection, Ravenous Swarm. You can do Creeping Doom. You can, I think with the Thistle Mace, you can do Mass Regen. And having these guys just drop in to whatever province you want to, where they weren't expecting it, and having a boatload of Creeping Dooms go off, or having a boatload of, Mass Protection on a PD dump. There's just so many different ways to surprise people with them. It's really cool. Importantly, they're also blood mages. So they can do Leech. They can do Reinvigoration after their script. They can summon imps if you if you want them to. They're reasonably cheap as far as mages go. And they can also jump into Sabbaths. So that is something they excel at. And we'll get now talking about some of the tricks. Like, what are the things this nation can do? One of the things is these guys make excellent Blackheart Assassins. These are terrifying to fight. Like, imagine a Creeping Doom dude with a lifelong protection assassinating you. What are you going to do? And they're horrifying to fight against. They do, by the way, have a few randoms. You can get a nature, death, fire, or blood random. But yeah, these guys, Blackheart Assassins, very, very, very scary. Very scary. What else can they do? Well, we've talked about having them jump in and buff things. They're also, like I mentioned, Nature 2 is a great buffing path. And when we start looking at thugging some of these guys out, these are recruit anywhere. Your Death 2s, by the way, are going to be able to do Soul Vortex. And then now we're looking at like excellent thug paths. And you combine in a way there to fluff them, to give them Enlarge and Regen and some other stuff. They can potentially be very scary. They have some problems, like really bad morale, but that's all fixable. They have bad attack and defense stats, but, if you have good protection, defense doesn't matter as much. And attack you can kind of fix with, like going Berserk. I think these guys probably are going to want to have a Flesh Eater. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to thug very much with 11 morale. But yeah, that's one of the things you can do with them is, combo this guy together with one of these guys. You're going to want a fair amount of gear on them. These are not going to be like super low gem gear dudes, I don't think. Though maybe you can get away with it. Yeah, so anyway, that's one thing they can do. Let's think about what else we can do with this nation. We have a lot of options for being stealthy. We have the Muke Jungle Warrior. You're probably going to want to have some bats, which you'll mostly keep out of combat, but use for siege chaff or showing up in very surprising ways to support battles. But I think the way, and I think these guys, no, not these guys. Are these guys stealthy? Oh, no, they're not. But I think the way you're going to want to play them is, I think you're probably going to want to use these bad toads at the beginning of the game to expand. And you might have to, depending on how your first war goes, if you're 2v1'd or whatever it is, you may have to just panic button, recruit as much stuff as you can, and then you'll be getting a lot of this. But I think you pretty much as soon as you can want to get out of the business of getting these garbage toads. These stealthy toads are a lot better. Just being able to jump in and out is a big boon for a really weak unit, because you don't want to have a really weak unit pinned into taking a fight. You want them to be able to show up when they want to. So I think in the mid game, you're probably going to have a bunch of these guys running around. And then they will be probably... it's also worth noting, they have enough hit points and enough protection. They're going to be mostly resistant to Flames from the Sky and Murdering Winter as you go into the late game too. But, these kinds of guys supporting armies. And then I think what your armies are probably going to be is mostly a mix of your Sacreds, who are going to be focusing on killing elites. This is as you get into the mid game. A mix of your Sacreds that are going to be focused on killing elites, with a lot of mage support focused on creating, buffing your army. So like these guys, once you get weapons of sharpness on them or mass protection or fog warriors, they suck a lot less. And then they're just there to basically be slightly useful while your Woe Mute kill stuff and your mages blast things and summon shit. So what are the buffs we can do? I mean, we can do a lot of things. Because we have Camazots, which can jump into communions, we can have very high level earth magic. Potentially we can even do earthquake plays. But in terms of buffs, we have Strength of Giants, we have Legions of Steel, we have Quickness, we have Quickening later in the game for our water mages. Getting our troops to have Quickness, is super valuable. We also have air access. There's a ton of things we get in Alteration, actually. We get Darkness, which most of our troops have built in some kind of dark vision. So we get Darkness, we get Mass Protection, we get Fog Warriors, we get Drain Life, potentially on some of our better Death Mages. Yeah, I mean, pretty good stuff. We get Quickening, which is really good. There's a lot of good stuff in water for Alteration, Wave Warriors is not bad. You can just make a lot of there's a lot of buffing and stuff you can do in Alteration that you just have great access to. So that I think is some of the mid-game. There's a lot of stuff you can do in Enchantment too, depending on who your neighbors are and what you think your first wars will be. You can do Foul Vapors like we were mentioning, so you can set your Bless up around that if you want to, but don't feel like you need to. You have Nature Mages, which can fly around and be anywhere. So as soon as you get Nature 5, you can drop Poison Ward for important fights. And once you get Nature 7, you can do Serpent's Blessing pretty trivially and get poison resistance on everybody. So don't feel like you have to take Nature as part of your Bless, because a lot of times, you're going to want to probably be using some mages which are not sacred in important fights, and you don't want them to get Foul Vapors to death. So you're probably going to be dropping Poison Ward yourself. You can also do fatigue plays. And I think this brings us to an important point, where when we're looking at Pretender design, what are the things we want to get? In my opinion, when you're looking at Pretenders, you can either choose to focus on the strengths of the nation and bring those out more. So if you have a really good Sacred, you could make it even better. Or you can try to patch weaknesses. And the better your Sacred is, the more you're probably going to look to play to its strengths and maybe fix a few holes in the Sacred itself. Whereas if you have not as great of a Sacred, or you're not going to be able to spam out Sacreds, like Xibalba is not going to be able to spam out Sacreds, you're going to look to, instead of having like this all-around Sacred that can do everything, you're going to want to make the Sacred good at something. And I think, in my opinion, that's probably what you want to do with Xibalba. So you can have it do a few different jobs. You could have it be, let's take a look. What should we do? We can do this with, the model is probably a little expensive. Earth, Nature, Blood. I think this actually is what we would want. But you could, in my opinion, you're going to want strength things. You can get larger. It's going to give you lower packing on your Sacreds, but I actually don't think that's a problem, even if you're using the big Womute, because you just have the little chaff guys or skeletons streaming behind them, and that should be okay. But you could do like something like larger, and then you get low light vision, which is going to, I think, bring these guys up to 100, which would be nice. And then you can throw in some minor poison resistance, which is great. And then you can throw in maybe 2 strength of flesh. And now they're going to be very killy. And I'm not exactly sure how we'll balance this out. But this brings us to an important point about how we're going to play this nation. You can go Heat Xibalba, and there's a lot of reasons you may want to do that. And the primary reason, of course, is you do have a lot of cold-blooded units who are going to suck as mages. The bats are not very important as troops, but the mages, the Camazots, are very important, and so are the Ways. So you can go for a Heat 3 build, where your mages will be a lot better in combat. If you're fighting in Cold 3, you're just going to be very, very sad as a cold-blooded mage. That being said, you do have a lot of water mages, and a lot of times people don't take cold resistance because it's one of the things that doesn't really help you much into the late game, because as soon as you get Frostfend or something, you might as well, your bless on your cold points is kind of wasted. And it's not the kind of thing like, fire elementals are going to come out and murder you the same way if you don't take cold resistance. Water elementals, ice elementals would do some cold damage, but it's not the same, right? You oftentimes don't get punished super hard, especially in the Middle Age, for not taking cold resistance. So one thing you could choose to do is you could choose to go cold 2, and this will give you a lot of points, and it's going to make your Grip of Winter, which you can cast very easily. So if you do this, you're probably going to want to go for like an enchantment style focus, where you're going to get enchantment very quickly. You're going to get Foul Vapors and Grip of Winter and Rigor Mortis out, and you're just going to blow people up with that, and you're going to be counting on them not having cold resistance. So the player in the tournament did take a cold build, and that is what he played. I think he expressed some regrets about it. But that being said, I think it's viable. The thing I think you have to do to play around this is twofold. One is that you're going to need to have a lot of white mages. So all your Camazots you get, you need to plan on white maging as many of those as you possibly can, which is going to cost you a lot of death gems. So that's one thing I think you need to do. The second thing is you probably need to make good use of communions. And one of the things that's nice about communions is you can get around a lot of the penalties of being cold-blooded by being in a communion. You can do reinvigoration to get rid of your fatigue at the end of the script. And then communion slaves themselves don't have any penalty for being cold-blooded, really. So all the mages you have as communion slaves, it's totally fine if they're cold-blooded. So ideally, if you had white mages to lead your communions, mostly, and your other guys to just be in the back, that could be pretty good. However, if you go the cold build, which I'm not necessarily recommending, I'm just explaining it's an option. If you go the cold build, and people have cold resistance, then you've kind of screwed yourself. By the way, later in the game, people are going to get cold resistance. So this is it's like a window thing, right? So it's not like, oh God, we have cold, we're going to be so strong all game. No, it's more like there's some plays you can do at certain times. And if you're going to be going on an offensive war, it doesn't really matter what the minion you have at home. It matters more what the minion you're fighting into. Anyway. But that is an option. If you go cold, you're using your water mages primarily for doing Grip of Winter and blasting people with that. By the way, you're also a nation that can do good morale plays. You can do Wailing Winds, and you can do Grip of Winter. Blood Rain pretty easily in the late mid game. So you have, this is a nation with pretty good access to to fatigue and to morale plays too, which is worth pointing out. Okay, if we were to, let's just finish building this pretender real quick. I have no idea. I hadn't pre-planned this. You could go for a Dormant Titan, because this is a nation which probably wouldn't mind a little bit of help in the first war. Now, magic scales, this is a nation that could dump and go drain. There's one problem with it, and it's the same thing that happened to me when I played Early Age Xibalba. I was like, oh, we can do magic boosters, and it'll be like fine. We'll have imps, and we'll have we don't have fire magic for Middle Age Xibalba, so we can't do lanterns, but we can do skull mentors, and we can do quills. We can do a bunch of things. It'd be like, great. It'll kind of mitigate the bad parts of drain. The problem is you're going to be heavily relying on Sabbaths, and Sabbaths, especially with Blood 1 mages, suck in drain. So for that reason, I think, especially since if you're getting rushed, you're going to want to be using your mages at home. You're probably going to want to have... We'll go all the way up to Heat 3 here. You're probably going to want to have at least Magic 1. Magic 1 is kind of the critical threshold. Honestly, if you go cold, like if we did the cold 2 build, I think you probably honestly need to have Magic 2. And we could do the math, but you're going to be taking the additional fatigue hit from a lot of your... Like the reason I kind of haven't said why. The reason why you want to have some Magic if you're doing Sabbaths is when you cast Communion Master, you will knock your ass out. Like you'll be at like 130 fatigue if you're in Drain 3. And then add on top of that any encumbrance. So if it's like Cold 3, Drain 3, you'll probably be at like 145 fatigue, which means it'll be like turn 7 before your Sabbath Masters even get to wake up. That's if they're Blood 1. If they're Blood 2, it's not as bad. If they're Blood 2, they probably would be fine. They'd probably be awake right after they cast it. And you have access to Blood 2s. Like you could use your Blood 2 Camazots, but your ways, they're always Blood 1, basically. So these are things to consider. And the reason, for going maybe Magic 2 instead of Magic 1, if you're in cold, is you're going to be taking that additional... Magic 1 will basically make it cost, I believe, 90 fatigue. But I believe that will be overridden by your encumbrance plus your cold-blooded penalty, which may put you right above 100. So you may want to go Magic 2 if you're cold. In Heat, it won't matter as much. Because you get the cold-blooded penalty and then you get the severe cold penalty. In Heat, you're still, I think, going to get a severe heat penalty. But such is the world we live in. You go neutral temperature scales too, or the default cold Heat 1 too if you wanted. In this case, I think we're going to make this for Heat 3, and we'll do Drain 1. To make a lot of our little toadies, let's take a look at their resource costs. Twice as much recruitment as resources. And then our good toadies, which are like these guys, are about equal. And our cap only are about equal. And so if we're doing this build, we probably want to get a few cap only, like probably at least the minion 7. And I think for this, we're going to need the points. We probably have to sack luck. You can do blood fecundity on your important places, so you can probably get away with only growth 1. Though I get the feeling... I don't think we can max out sacred... Like, I don't think we can get 8 or 7 sacreds a turn doing this. Probably too high a dominion. This might be fine. And I don't know. We'd have to play through. We'll do a playthrough of this. But scales, maybe something like this might be fine. 25 is just a painful amount to have left over, though. Painful amount. I'll show you all some of the other builds I did, too, which I'm not going to... I'll just tell you why I was thinking about them, just so you get to look at them. I don't think a lot of them are necessarily great, but Middle Ages Xibalba, we've made a few of them. So, first off, we have this guy, which is okay. We get some undead command, some undying. Basically, the death we've got mostly for Spirit Sight, which honestly doesn't even make sense. I don't even like this very much. Spirit Sight, we already have some Dark Vision. I don't know why we would get that. You would probably just... Yeah, I think that's like totally a mistake. We can do another monolith after this, because I'm pretty sure I made a monolith that wasn't complete garbage. Let's make a monolith right here. Okay, so the monolith... the Astral, we actually don't need for a ton of things. I think one important thing about getting Astral, and one thing I like about this, is this nation doesn't have access to Earth Astral, and being able to make matrices and stuff is really, really nice. So that's one thing I do like about this. I'll get some nature too. Yeah, I think for this, larger I think is a pretty good value on the Womuke. You just get a lot of HP and strength for what you pay. And throwing in this is going to make them pretty resistant to a lot of the poison stuff. It's also going to help, by the way, a tiny bit of poison resistance is going to help you thug underwater a ton. Because a lot of times you don't want to put poison resistance gears on your thugs, and you totally can thug underwater. You already have magic weapons on most of your important troops, so you're just going to take a bit of MR, and I think call it. You know, you potentially, for big liquefy casters, your big liquefy casters are sacred. You could potentially do Farcaster here and just drop liquefy from, you know, across the field. So that's another option. But for this, you would basically go imprisoned. You're going to get the benefit of larger. If you wanted to do it too, you could add more earth, or you could take blood and jump up strength a little more. But with this, we basically can go full scales. And we'll actually build this god out because... well, let's take the least greedy scales. Okay, which ones are we going to sacrifice? I think we'll sacrifice luck in this case. Yeah, because we probably could have a lot of Womuke like this. I think I'm okay with that. Yeah. So this would be like a scales build. Have a lot of money. You get some bad luck. You could also, I mean, look, if you want to take luck 3 too, like especially if you're playing single player, I would totally recommend luck 3. You know. Well, let me see. What would we do? You probably would drop, you probably don't need all that magic. Probably would drop this one a bit. Drop this down to 7. This would probably be like a luck 3 build. There's a lot of good events that are at like magic 3, luck 3 though, so it might be worth doing this even. But this is more greedy. This is a lot more greedy. I think it's better to have more sacred production. I mean, you could cut growth down this way too. This is a lot less greedy. This is probably fine. And then you do blood fecundity. The thing is, when you're going scales, I feel like growth is the best scale. And it'd be nice to spend your blood on other things too. Go magic 1. Yeah, it's something like this. I'm not totally sure about the right way to do scales on this, but this is basically like a full scales build where you have a pretty nice little utility bless. There's some downsides to this, like some of your size, and you see I've taken larger on a few things, but these guys, you'd normally be able to pack 2 per square, and if you were fluffing them, you'd be able to, like, you know, have another guy in the same square with them. But what you still can do is these guys, you can have them buffed by a Way or a Camazot. They're going to jump up to size 4. However, you can still fit a size 2 in with them. That's not sacred. And none of your bats are sacred here. Only the toads are. So anyway, this is a scales build. We'll try this out in the next episode. And I'll show you a few of the other builds real quick. Some of these are problems, have problems with scales and things like that, but there's some kind of interesting ideas. Maybe just get your brain cells firing on something. So this kind of interesting attack, Blood Surge, and an expander. This god expands very well, especially with a Killy Bless. He spawns with a bunch of Sacred Jaguars, and it's very fun, especially if you're playing single player and you want to have a fun time. This is a very fun pretender. He's very, very killy, and his little pack of sacreds he gets will just murder stuff. He gets 2d6 Sacred Jaguars, and you just make sure he runs into combat right with them, and they will tear things apart. Very cool. You can do a god sort of like that on early age Xibalba as well. Next up, we have, this is kind of funny. This is an Awake expander that is made primarily for Assassin expansion, and there's problems with this. Like Drain 3, I would not really recommend this in a multiplayer game and it's cold, so this is like a bad combination. And it's one of the things posted this, I think, in my channel, and Sai was like, dude, you can't do that. And I was like, oh, fuck, I forgot. It's the same thing that got me ruined in the first Xibalba game, was taking Drain, because I'm like, oh, I can make up for it with magic boosters. Oh, yeah, you're using Sabbaths. You can't. So, yeah, don't do this. And you can swap this around and maybe go Misfortune. Or probably you would have to sack some Growth. I don't think you would want to go Death, but I think you could go Growth 1 and then maybe trim these scales up a little bit tighter, because you've got an expander, and this Bless is also, so it's going to be online from the beginning, and larger Berserker and Blood Surge, or I'm sorry, not Blood Surge, this is only Blessed, but these two, Larger and Berserker, are going to apply to Sacred units, not Blessed, and what that means is your Assassins are going to get benefit from them. So you basically are going to have a Titan chassis, which is going to be running around, totally capable, by the way, of expanding. You have to be a little tricky. She's not a great expander till you get some research online, but you can tell she's going to be an absolute monster once she gets going. But she can, especially with her Horned Serpents, she can take out easy provinces by herself. She doesn't benefit from Larger, but the Berserker's nice. And by the way, these are both very nice on your thugs. Berserker's pretty good, because you remember we were talking about we'd have to put a Flesh Eater on them to fix their bad morale. Well, this fixes that right away. You know, you can kind of abuse it by getting it triggered turn 1 and stuff, so you have to be careful. But yeah, you basically are going to have a Titan which can expand, and you're going to have Assassins which you're going to be spamming out of your capital, which will be rather scary with Larger and Berserker on them. And especially if you go out and you find some nature sites. For your first war, you put a bunch of handful of acorns on them, which is just construction 2. And then you just ruin people's day with your little Muke Assassins. So Zan, if you're watching, that's probably the build for you, buddy, since you love Assassin Cancer. But anyway, this is pretty interesting too. It also fills a role of having your Sacreds do a pretty good job at killing things. Like Berserk is pretty good against a lot of thugs, because, you know, they get triggered, they take a little damage, they're going to hit a lot harder with higher attack. And then Larger Berserk, they're just going to be pounding things really hard. I think it's total +5 strength once Berserk is active, and then you get the bonus attack, and you get the morale bonus. And then once they kill things, they get the Blood Surge. They become very killy with all these things active. Anyway, that is this build. I think you'd have to change scales, but I think, and maybe rebalance some things for how many Sacreds you're going to get out, because, you know, you want to figure out how many of the Sacreds, like the Wolmook or whatever assassin or whatever Sacred it is you want to produce out of your capital. You want to line up the number of candles with each of these two scales so that you get the most amount out. And if you're, you know, given how much you can put in here, once you have these two balanced, if you can't make enough Sacreds, you decrease the candles. So you have to balance that out. This isn't totally balanced. I think it's sort of right. We did a different version where we took better scales, but we had more strength. And this is without... So this is less focused on the Assassins. This is more just like a Dormant Bless where we have... wait, is this the one we just made? That's the one we just made. Here I am talking about it like it's some new weird thing. Yeah, and then this one. So I think that's it, guys. Let's do closing thoughts. Middle-aged Xibalba, you have a lot of gimmicks. I feel like I haven't talked about a ton of the gimmicks. A lot of it, you're going to be doing stealthy stuff. You're going to be doing all the blood summons that you can get your hands on. So like later in the game, it'll be Fiends of Darkness, potentially the Frost Devils. You have Camazot, so you can do Demon Knights and stuff too. You have Air Blood, so you can do Storm Demons, though you're going to have to make probably an Air Hat for each of those. And a lot of those are going to, like, your late game is really going to come online at turn... well, you know, once you have Blood 9 and stuff. So that will be a bit of a ways out. But, you know, like late game for you is a bunch of the generic demons. Middle game for you, you can do all sorts of blood stuff. You can do the morale plays with Blood Rain and Wailing Winds. You can do... you can even do Bloodletting a bunch if you want to. You can do all the fatigue plays. So it's a nation that has access to a lot of those. You also have great access to buffing, as we were talking about. But you have kind of garbage stuff to put it on, aside from sort of your sacreds. So, in my opinion, the middle game way to play them is a few elites mixed in with lots of chaff, doing either morale or fatigue plays. In the early game, if you get rushed, it's probably going to be a shit ton of imps. It's going to be a bunch of your sacreds, and then if you have a cool god, it's going to be your god just taking names and kicking ass. So yeah, I think that's kind of how they play. So I will see you guys next time. We'll practice expansion, and we'll see how that goes. Take care.